And the CFO often has other fish to fry, including going on road shows for financing and dealing with investment in commercial banks and all kinds of other problems. So there isn't typically a function in a company that deals with working capital. And that's a shame, because there are many, many opportunities out there, at least based on what I've seen and working with, well, actually over 250 companies. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. I know that you were told there's a case in the notebook that I want to talk about and get your opinions about and see what we can do to help our friends at this somewhat troubled company and so on. So without any further ado, I know you all know what working capital is, so this is a gratuitous slide that's unnecessary, but I thought I'd mention it. The definition, of course, is current assets, CA minus CL, current liabilities. You all know that. And the two standard ratios that measure this are the current ratio and the quick, or sometimes called the acid test ratio, which simply subtracts inventory in the numerator on the theory that there's no way to know the true value of inventory, and therefore the quick is a better measure than the current ratio. An awful lot of financial people have come to the conclusion that the current ratio is relatively meaningless, because mixed in that ratio is not only inventory, which could be stale and unsaleable or accepted at an extreme discount, but also accounts receivable, some of which may not be collectible. Now, the traditional view, as I'm sure many of you know, was that a very high number, much greater than 1-to-1, was the goal. But that's the traditional view. That's what we were taught, back during the Lincoln administration when I was in college. No, I think it was actually after the Lincoln. Well, we won't go there. And so you wanted to focus on a very high ratio. Here's a little secret. This misinformation about having high ratios was really driven by bankers. Why? Because bankers were the original users of ratio analysis, and they wanted to see that you could repay any loan that you borrow. A corporation could repay a loan, and the higher the working capital ratios, the better in terms of the viewpoint of the banker. But you being a corporate, or at least some of you being corporates, your viewpoint should be kind of the reverse. You want to manage your company optimally, and if the banker is troubled or has a question or has a problem, well, so be it. Then he has or she has to ask that question. So the modern view, which you see at the bottom of the slide, is that working capital is undesirable because it drags performance. It doesn't really add anything to the profitability of the firm, and just sits on the balance sheet awaiting disposition in one form or another. So you have to actively manage those assets and liabilities. Of course, they're liabilities, very aggressively, and focus as much as possible, as you see at the bottom there, on funding current liabilities from operations. Now, the classic company that has been successful, probably to a greater degree than any other company in the world on this, at least in the past, it was Dell Computer, because Dell was able to get people to pay for the machine when it was ready to be shipped. They would take your credit card number, or they had a purchase order if it was a corporate account, and they never had any parts or inventory on their balance sheet. The suppliers were stationed adjacent in a site adjacent to Dell and their assembly facilities. But the parts that were used to build computers were actually on the supplier's balance sheet. So they would send an email message to their suppliers saying, we need so many parts to build so many computers, and that's the first time that those parts would leave the balance sheet of the suppliers. Doing that, Dell was able to keep all of that inventory to a minimum. They were able to keep accounts receivable to a minimum, and they had very little in the way of any working capital activity. So if you're looking for a test case, and by the way, I talk about this in my book, but it's been written up many times, arguably the best in the world, in the past at least, has been Dell. Now, working capital has a lot of effects on a balance sheet and on the income statement of the company, because if you allow working capital to increase beyond where it should be, then it sort of creates a domino effect of bad things. Greater use inevitably of cash, which will probably lead to increased borrowing and if you read the case, you know that's exactly what occurred in the case I wrote for this session. The more borrowing, probably the higher your interest cost or interest expense, the lower your profits. You can read the slide. Deteriorating key financial ratios may result, and conceivably a possible lower credit rating. Now, this isn't hypothetical. This is what we have actually seen in companies that we work with. And a lot of the times, the interesting thing is that the company has said, what's going on here? We don't understand our own problems. Explain it to us. You do the analysis. Now, this may sound bizarre, but that's what we've heard. And so we've seen this with a whole variety of industries. And on this slide, I just put a few of the industries that we've worked with. And these are real numbers. This isn't made up for purposes of coming in here and talking to you. This is really what we saw in a variety of situations. These are as you see, just five different industries, companies in 5 different industries. But I could have extended the list to multiple slides. Now, forgetting the second column, which is the annual sales, this just gives you an idea of magnitude. The annual savings can be very, very extensive. And we've actually done studies where companies, albeit large companies, but companies saved in the range of 8 figures a year. And I'll let you figure out, well, how many decimals is that? What does that work out to? Now, I'll make it easy for you after lunch. It's tens of millions of dollars a year in improvements that can come about through a more efficient working capital management. And there have certainly been plenty of situations where clients have saved over $1 million a year. This isn't by way of trying to sell you anything. It's just to say that businesses around the world, it's not just American companies, I've worked in Canada, I've worked in Europe and so on, continue to not do an adequate job in managing working capital. Now, one of the problems, and I've written about this for a number of years, talked about it, and everybody says, maybe there's something